Welcome to Race to Zero, our series of interviews discovering the world of Hitachi. Today we have the pleasure to have Ram Ramachander, Hitachi's Head of Social Innovation for EMEA. Ram, thank you very much for being with us and welcome.
Hi Carlo, good to be here.
So Hitachi aims at creating a sustainable society through social innovation. What is social innovation exactly? Why is it at the heart and soul of everything Hitachi does and creates?
Social innovation has been in our mission statement since 1910. And the idea is to innovate with superior technology to improve society. And that is not just a mission statement, but it's also a philosophy and an approach that I think is very relevant to modern day challenges. If you take climate change, if you take COVID, etc. Now, the best way to frame it in today's environment is to really look at the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are really an agenda for the future of the planet. And social innovation is really innovation that advances that agenda or accelerates that agenda through technological improvement or innovation. So how we go about that is really essentially my unit acts as almost like a startup agile unit that looks from the market in, looks at the major challenges that are happening in the market like climate change, and start to develop transformative ventures that can fundamentally accelerate that issue. So if you take EV as a great example for this, and I'll use this often because it's part of the business that I'm running, is really, if you take our energy capability as a business unit, our mobility capability and our digital capability, we bring all of that together, and then we partner with external innovators and startups and other partners to create a new transformative venture that can accelerate the uptake of EV and enable the energy companies to be able to meet that challenging demand coming down the line.
When it comes to decarbonizing different countries and societies, there is not a one-size-fits-it-all solution. You always mention the necessity to create an ecosystem that interconnects different businesses and technologies to fully leverage the potential of each solution in the fight against climate change. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this idea?
So it is important that when we get to things like COP26, that we drive common goals, common targets, common agendas across the planet to create momentum. Then at a regional and at a country level, we need a very strong policy to be able to drive an execution plan that's specific to that area, which is why I often talk about having a slightly different approach to Europe versus APAC versus America, etc., but addressing the same problem. Because look, as we transition out of our traditional systems of operating into a more green infrastructure, new ecosystems get created. Again, I'll use EV as an example here. Today, you and I would get in the car and go to the gas station and fill up our car. Tomorrow, or even today, some of us own EVs, you're plugged into the grid, you need a charger, you worry about range, you worry about how much energy that you're utilizing. Can I charge this at the right time? The energy companies worry about how many vehicles get plugged into the grid at any point. So you're now creating a brand new relationship, a brand new value chain, but it's a lot more distributed and very complex in its interconnection. So it's important to recognize that complexity and start to deal with that. And the underlying thread that brings it all together for us is data and digital. So as we move to complexity, it is also very, very important that we manage these infrastructure using digital technologies and optimize how we connect this whole system together.
You have worked in the Silicon Valley, witnessing many startups grow and flourish and others go bust. When you think about the vast array of technologies available to facilitate the ecological transition, which ones do you think have the most potential to be scaled up and be widely adopted?
The thing I watch quite a lot is where is the investment going? Where is the money going in terms of the valley? And right now, nearly 60% of all of the fund's investment have gone into mobility and transportation. And the second large being energy supply. Out of all of those verticals, between energy supply and mobility and transportation, there's almost 70% of all of the fund's investment focus are driven in that area. So therefore, focusing very hard on enabling that transition as a company will be quite lucrative. The kind of areas that we can think about are areas like road transportation optimization, battery management optimization in the world of EV, charger infrastructure, and transition to possible hydrogen technologies, either in the supply or in the mobility world. And again, digital proliferates across all of these areas, but this time they're quite embedded into the solution itself. So companies that have strong technologies that support the transition of mobility into zero carbon, great. And then, but also very embedded in not just selling software, but really embedded in the transformation and the transition capability linked to infrastructure. So the software and smart infrastructure coming together. And in the work that we're doing in Hitachi, where we're moving an EV as a service or vehicle as a service kind of business, is bringing all of that stuff together into a single point transition point solution for our customers to accelerate their take up.
By 2050, according to the United Nations, 7 out of 10 people are projected to live in urban areas. How is Hitachi contributing to develop a more sustainable and smart environment in cities, raising the living standards of their inhabitants?
So, as you know, Hitachi has quite a lot of capability around infrastructure in transportation, in energy, etc. One of the things that we're starting to think about is how do you connect all of those components together in a smart city environment? Okay, so going back to my conversation about Environment 1.0, smart city was quite a nebulous conversation. It was so big that you couldn't really get your hands around how do you transform a city into a much more sustainable city. It's too big a problem to solve. So we then landed on solving component related issues, optimizing renewable energy, optimizing distributed energy, etc., etc. Now, we're starting to think about, for instance, how do we connect things like mobility across multimodal areas to create a smart mobility and more efficient mobility environment. So, for instance, our rail business is pushing forward with the mobility as a service capability that creates not just the rail push, but also how does that connect to the public transportation system as a whole, which then interconnects the last mile travel to create a much more seamless and much more efficient travel environment. Now, when you plug that into the EV work that we're doing, you get that very interesting conjecture coming together of decarbonized transportation, intelligent multimodal and mobility as a service, making that whole process of travel a much more efficient way of moving the city forward, right, in terms of what we're doing. It's complicated, but we are now putting those puzzle pieces together to start to create much more sustainable cities as a whole.
And lastly, a very brief question. What does climate innovation mean to you, really?
Firstly, we need to bridge the gap between the enormous amount of funding that's available and the amount of funding that's available from the government to make this transition. Let me explain. Government will move forward with targets, with funding to encourage the transition process. But we also need to take that capability, that funding, to create momentum in the private sector funding or the big ESG funds that want to invest in the new green infrastructure. But to bring those two worlds together, we need to bridge a gap of understanding between how the financial world sees risk and management of risk in future infrastructure and what the policies are that are driving that transition. If we do that, we can accelerate the climate change solutions to the problem, or the technologies that already exist. So that's one of the fundamental things I think as we innovate we need to take forward. The second thing is the innovation is really around the business models. Okay, so as we try and encourage, if you're transitioning again in the EV, and your entire fleet, which could be thousands of vehicles, from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, etc., it's a very expensive process for a company to take on, or for a government to take on. It's really important that companies like us and other big, larger organizations start to take new business models into the world that take that massive capex investment requirement into a much more opex model, like pence per mile, like monthly cost of operating a fleet, etc., etc. So I think the innovation and the thinking now needs to move more into the financing and the business modeling rather than just the technological innovation, if that makes any sense.
Well, thank you, Ram, for this insightful conversation. Ram Ramachander, Hitachi's Head of Social Innovation for EMEA. Again, thank you.
Thanks, Carlo.
So this is it for Race to Zero, our series of interviews discovering the world of Hitachi. Do stay with us. Goodbye.